one of the problems in Civil War studies, it's true for all of history, but it's especially true for the Civil War, is that there were so many people who survived the war and wrote accounts later, 1 year, 10 years, 30, 40, 50 years later. And so, of course, you get conflicting memories of what people saw, what they think they saw, what they've heard, etc. I was reminding of that listening to Ski just a moment ago. As I remember that 7 years ago, this was all Ski's idea. Okay. But as is typical with Dr. Shaner, when he talks, you think everybody else in the room had all the great ideas and he was just there taking notes. We are blessed to have him as a leader and the guiding spirit of this symposium, and may he do so for a lot more years. We're talking this morning about J. Warren Kiefer. Now, some of you will say that I have no idea who that is, because you're from out of town and you don't hear the name Kiefer. If you're in town, those of us who are local, we know it, we at least have a school name for him. And if we know a little bit of local history, we know he was fairly prominent. But he's not a well-known figure. And certainly on the national level, he's not a well-known figure. My job is the opposite of Ethan Rayfuse's job coming up. He's got a figure everybody knows and has an opinion about. And that's not true for Kiefer. So the way this is going to work, if you can see the outline, there are 4 segments to the talk. So if you want to nod off in one segment, that's fine. You'll be able to know where we are. I'm going to give you a quick overview of his life, and then a quick overview of the war for Kiefer. And then we're going to dive into 2 particular moments in the war in which Kiefer and his men and Kiefer's account of what happened are particularly important, okay? So that's the outline. There are a lot of slides. You can always just watch the slides. You'll note that today is the 85th anniversary of J. Warren Kiefer's death. He died on April 22nd at 5:15 in the morning on a Friday. He'd been unconscious since Wednesday. He'd been sick for about a week. He was 96 years old. As you'll see, this is a fellow who did not stop. He was active his entire life and active in public affairs for something like 7 decades or so. This is a painting of Kiefer by a member of the Frankenstein family. The Frankensteins were a local family of artists. It's spelled the same as the other Frankenstein, but they were actually from Germany. And Gustav painted this one of him fairly early in life. Kiefer was born in east of Springfield, near the Mad River, and raised on a farm. Little schooling, but did get some schooling. Spent a little bit of time at a brand new college called Antioch College, not much time there. And he decided about age 16 that what he really wanted to do was something other than farm. And what came to his mind was practicing law. His mother thought that was a good idea. So he studied law the way people did in those days. He read law with a local attorney in Springfield. And he read law for a couple of years and was admitted to the bar in 1858. So he's a pretty young man. And was practicing law in the Springfield area, 1859, 60, early 61. So he was practicing law for about 3 years when the Civil War broke out in 1861 when he was 27. He joined within just a few days of Lincoln's call for volunteers, and he's in uniform until the end of the war. He mustered out in June of 1865. So he is a 4-year soldier and a very early volunteer. He was quickly elected to the unit he was in. He was quickly elected a major. He would have entered as a private, but then they held elections, and he was a lawyer, right? And he was already an impressive figure, and so they made him an officer pretty quickly. He starts out as a major. In the first couple of years of the war, he rose in the ranks to a colonel. After the war, he returned to Springfield, resumed the practice of law, did rather well. This was his house on East High Street, where he would die many decades later. This is from an 1875 atlas. You can tell it was a nice place. Kiefer initially was not involved in politics, but as he watched events in the 1870s and 80s, was drawn into politics, served in the state Senate for a term, and in the 1870s entered the U.S. Congress as the representative from this district. Now, he served in that time period 4 terms. One of those terms as Speaker of the House. He was the first Ohioan to be the Speaker of the House. He's one of 2 Ohioans to represent Springfield and Clark County while Speaker of the House. The second one was John Boehner, recently, of course. He is in politics at the national level in a very difficult time period. The Reconstruction period, the so-called Gilded Age period. We historians routinely talk about corruption and fraud and too much money being handed out to congressmen. And you might think that sounds familiar. But the difference was in the 1880s, we didn't have a regulatory system in place yet, right? And of course, great fortunes were being made in industry, the railroads, steel, et cetera, oil eventually, sugar. And as those great fortunes are being made, there's just a lot of money lying around. There are very few rules for people to sort of navigate this new system. And so political disputes were always couched in terms like corruption or dishonesty or fraud. It was a very, very hostile political environment. And it was in the middle of that the Ohio generation kind of emerged into national leadership positions. And Keifer even served 1 term as Speaker, as I said. It was not a pleasant time. It was a fairly tough time. These, I don't know how well you can see these. These are a series of cartoons from Puck, the famous cartoons of that era. Lovely colored cartoons. And this one is showing him as, he's on the right, as the corrupt tool of Hobson et al. That is, he's one of these people who's been bought off by some corrupt interests. You'd be hard-pressed to prove that, by the way. This is a political attack on him at the time, so don't be too upset. But Puck did not like Keifer, but then Puck didn't like Republicans in general, so that's not too unusual. This is Uncle Sam and his family in desperate need of help and reform, and they're watching the railroad car, which is the 47th Congress, ride off and saying, catch the next car. If you want reform, wait till next time, because we're not doing it. The conductor of that railroad car is J. Warren Keifer. By the way, the 48th Congress wasn't much more help, as it turned out. This is another one full of Republicans who were basically asleep on the job. Okay, you get the idea. It was a very difficult time period, tempestuous, contentious. This one's kind of mean-spirited. These are a bunch of fellows who had the fellows in the sacks above the woman are people who had war records. And of course, men used their war records to run for office. And by the 1880s, that was getting a little old. And so some people were starting to say, okay, we're kind of tired of the war record. And she's the woman, she's representing the one person who's being burdened by all those war records, saying, look, this is just more weight than she can carry. It's that generation's way of saying, time to move on. Thank you for your service, but that was then, this is now. Keifer served 1 term. He was not reelected for a 2nd term as Speaker. The New York Times enjoyed going after Keifer, and they ran a lot of stories on him. This is talking about, it says, what the ex-Speaker will not decline a renomination. Well, he didn't decline. He didn't have to. They decided they didn't want him and moved on to somebody else. Finally, you see, this is mid-1880s. He's out of politics. He didn't even get re-election at home. Clark County did not return him to the Congress, and so he's out. Remember that title, Out of Politics. You'll chuckle in a few minutes. He was still well known, however. This is Keifer supporting McKinley for president in the 1890s. Another fellow Ohioan, of course. And then the Spanish-American War broke out in 1898. Now, Keifer is not a young man at this point, right? But he volunteered to serve and was made Major General of Volunteers. So he's a general, and he's back in service. And indeed, he ends up in Cuba, goes to to Havana. is not there very long because his wife was gravely ill, and he and his son returned. And in fact, she died before they were able to return. So his military service in the Spanish-American War always carried the memory of his wife's death. This is General Kiefer in that time period. He looks a lot like Robert E. Lee, doesn't he? And this is Kiefer with some other officers at the time. This is a great photo of Kiefer about the turn of the century. As you see, he looks like the elder statesman that he was. A very distinguished figure, imposing with bearing. He had a reputation as an orator most of his life, and all these things would fit well together. That's probably a better image. And at the end of the century, he wrote a history. God bless him. A lot of Civil War soldiers and politicians and civilians wrote memoirs, of course, about the war. Kiefer did something rather interesting. He, like a lot of folks, he gave speeches on the war, gave talks about different engagements that he'd seen. Some of those were published by the 1880s. By the 1880s and 90s, the official records were being published, so people had more access to copies of orders that were given in official reports. Plus, a lot of the major memoirs of the major players were out by then. Grant's memoir, Sherman's, etc. And so Kiefer wrote, when he sat down to write about the war, he didn't simply write a memoir of his personal experiences or of his experiences in the Ohio 110th, which was his unit, his chief unit for most of the war. Instead, he wrote a 2-volume history. Most of the first volume is about the origins of the Civil War, and it's about slavery. And you see that in the title, Slavery in 4 Years of War. And it's a fairly conventional Northern interpretation of how slavery was the issue, and that's what led to the war. And he gives a rather even-handed, a good picture, at least for that time period. He was not a professional historian, but he clearly did a fair amount of research. Then the rest of that volume and all of the next volume were about the war itself. And writing about the war, when you're writing a memoir, especially if you're writing about your regiment or your experiences, one difficulty is that for any single person, unless you're at very high level of command, your picture of the war is pretty narrow. You know, you're seeing one portion of a field, one portion of a battle, maybe one portion of a campaign. And Kiefer knew that was a problem for the reader. So much of the history is a more general history of the war. He would tell enough about what was going on in the broader campaigns, the broader picture, at least as he could put it together. And then he would stop and talk about what he and his men were experiencing at that crucial moment. And it makes for a nice balance between the two, especially for the general reader. It's published by Putnam, so they were thinking about general readers. This wasn't just a work for specialists. I'll quote from it a few times as we go on here. But the writing style was rather direct, straightforward. I won't say plain and matter of fact. But it's not as stylized as a lot of works that you run into in this genre. And it has all the problems that these works have. There are issues of memory. You know, this is 3 decades later. Does he really remember that incident that clearly? I'm sure all of us remember exactly where we were 33 years ago in April, and of course we can't, right? On the other hand, he had his notes, he had copies of his reports, his orders, and he had access to a lot of other documents as well. So he clearly made an effort to make things accurate as to the degree he could. But there are also his interpretations. He met people in the war he did not like. He met people in the war he admired greatly. And some of the famous ones were not necessarily the ones he liked, and some of the ones who were not so famous were people he admired a lot. And so, you know, you get that personal flavor and his own biases in the thing. All right, got to move on. The New York Times, as I said, generally didn't like him, but they did give his book a positive review. All right, and then a few years later, he ran for Congress again. Remember the previous political headline, out of politics? Well, he's back. And this time he serves 3 terms in Congress. He doesn't serve as Speaker again. But this is a gentleman up into his 70s now, serving in the Congress of the United States. He, this time around, is quite an advocate of equal voting rights. This is him standing with two other former famous speakers of the House, elderly, all of them from the 19th century. I won't stop and identify him here. And around 1910, the New York Times ran this article on him. Kiefer ran, you saw it before, a swallowtail suit, where it's cut narrow here and then the tail goes behind. And he was still wearing those long after most people didn't. And so when he switched over to business suits, the Times ran an article sort of calling attention to this fact. There he is. He visited the White House around 1911 and said, if I'm needed, I can return to uniform. 1911, he was 74. He was nearly killed by a train and a car with two other governors. This is a guy who was born in the 1830s, and this is how long he has lived. He's into the railroad era now and the car era. He was in Europe at the end of July, early August 1914, when World War I broke out. He should have been at home. I mean, at his age, I'm not going to be touring the country on behalf of, Europe on behalf of my nation. But that's what he was doing. He was going to a conference, and World War I broke out, and his sons had to contact the State Department and say, could you please find our father? Because we haven't heard from him. We don't know if he's all right. He was okay. Turns out he was perfectly safe. This is him with General Pershing. All right. Here he is in the 1920s with our senator and another senator in the 1920s. He retired at age 91 from law and as president of the Laganda National Bank, which was down the street, a name that's familiar to many of us in the room. 91. And you can't see this, but in 1927, he gave an address on the radio at Wittenberg College's first radio station. So this is a Civil War general who made it to the radio. And finally died in 1932. And these are just a series of images of his funeral. There were 6 pallbearers. He's buried out at Ferncliff. Ski Shaner can show you the site and tell you all about it. One of the 6 honorary pallbearers was Benjamin Prince, the founding president and guiding spirit of this Clark County Historical Society for many years. All right, let's press on. I'm going to give you a quick look at his life, and then we're going to get into some individual battles. Those are the medallions, by the way. He's one of those unusual soldiers with a Civil War medallion on his gravesite and a Spanish-American War medallion on his site. He did not serve in World War I, but he had 4 grandsons serving in World War I. And that's the school we named after him. About the same time, it's still standing. It's gone through different service orientations, but it's still being used today. All right, Kiefer's War. This will be quick because we need to get to some battles here. As I said, he enlisted immediately in April 1861. These are his saddle and his writing set, his desk that he used in the field. They're in the collection. You can see them right out those doors, not very far down there. Also out those doors, you can see a beautiful oil painting of Kiefer a little bit later in life. It's another oil painting, of course. He was originally in the Ohio 3rd and elected major. They reorganized in June, and they saw action mostly originally in West Virginia. You can see here they were also at Rich Mountain, Cheat Mountain, and Elkwater by the early fall. These are well-known names to Civil War specialists, but not to the general public. But very early on in the war, there was a lot of concern about securing. Western Virginia was thought to be pro-Union and settlement, unlike the rest of Virginia. And so there was a lot of concern in Washington to secure as much of Western Virginia as was possible. It proved a hard area to secure permanently, of course. Early on in the conflict, notice the hat to the left there, that high, that's not a hat he would have worn very long. All right. Shortly thereafter, he was pretty soon for a while serving under General McClellan. Now, Ethan Rayfuse is coming up, is an expert on General McClellan, has written, I think, a wonderful book on him and gives him a much fairer account than a lot of historians have for the last 100 years. But Kiefer was, in his own book, was not happy with McClellan. He had not liked McClellan when he met him in 1861, and he still didn't like him in 1898. and you can see what he says here. McClellan was kind and generous, but weak, and so inordinately vain that he thought it unnecessary to accept the judgment of men of higher attainments and stronger character. Even now, and this is in the 1890s, strong men shudder when they recall the fact that George B. McClellan apparently had for a time in his keeping the destiny of the Republic. Ouch. The fact that they were in different political parties might have influenced that conclusion. McClellan was not disloyal, nor did he lack a technical military education. McClellan was an exceptionally well-educated military figure. He was a good husband, an indulgent father, a kind and devoted friend of pure life, but unfortunately, he was for a time mistaken for a great soldier, and this mistake he never discovered. Now, this is one place where I would not say Kiefer's judgments were fair and even-handed. I think this is a typical over-the-top criticism of McClellan, but I'm not the expert on that. And you feel free to disagree, of course. They were in Kentucky under General Buell for a while, as you see here. He was eventually promoted to lieutenant colonel, and then they saw action in Tennessee and in Alabama. So this is the early stages of the war in 61, 62. He's not in the major campaigns. These are volunteers. He's not a trained soldier. He's not a trained officer. He has no academy background, of course. But he is learning his craft. He's learning what it means to be an officer at that level. And the Union Army depended upon men like that. We sometimes refer to them as civilian officers, soldiers, or just politicians turned soldiers. He hadn't been a politician yet. As if somehow they weren't up to the job. But without those men, a lot of what happened the next 2 years wouldn't have been possible. It took a combination of the trained officers and the untrained officers with experience to run this massive army. The 1/10th was created by this district, the congressional district, and later in 1862, and he was commissioned as its colonel, and that's when he became a colonel. For late 62 and 63. There's a great book on this called The Weary Boys by Thomas Pope from the northern part of the state. These are the officers of the 1/10th early on. That's Kiefer sitting in the middle. You see, he's a young man. I mean, these guys were young. They were in West Virginia in the winter and spring and culminating in the Second Battle of Winchester, to which we're going to return very soon here. We'll come back to that. There he was commanded by General Milroy. After Winchester, Winchester was a disaster for the Union Army, and their units were reorganized into a brigade into the 3rd Corps under General French. This is General French. They were not at Gettysburg, and shortly after Gettysburg, they were sent to New York City. The New York City draft riots, as they're called, occurred in July of 1863, and the local militia and law enforcement simply couldn't control them. It took a long time to get it under control, and finally federal troops were brought in, and Kiefer's 1/10th was one of the regiments that went in to maintain order. So when the draft resumed late in the summer, things went in a pretty orderly way. They were grateful, the citizens were. They held a big party for them. And at that party, this song was sung. It's a song called Kiefer Leads the Van, and we don't have time to walk through it all, but the point is that it goes through. I'll show you the chorus here. Then march along, for Kiefer leads the van, and Foster, he will stick to us as long as there's a man. Then march along, for Binkley's with us too, and he will never square the books till Davis gets his due. And he was reminded of this decades later when someone brought a copy of this song to him at a public event. You know you're somebody when they write songs with your name in the title, right? Even then. The 1/10th was, as I said before, was recombined, placed under General French for a while. After the draft riot service, they fought at Brandy Station, also at Orange Grove, familiar names to specialists. Then the 3rd was dissolved in a general reorganization, and they were at the Wilderness, the beginning of Grant's massive spring campaign in 1864, in May of 1864. This was the massive Union campaign that was designed to move on multiple fronts, maximum use of the Union's material and human resources, and to put maximum pressure on the Confederates. And the Wilderness was one of the opening battles of that campaign, the Wilderness Campaign in Virginia. Keifer was severely wounded in that battle. We'll return to that. And he did not rejoin them until later in the summer, by which time he was going to be working under General Sheridan. When I reported to Sheridan, he later wrote, he looked at me. He arrived in camp with his arm in a sling and in splints. Okay, and so he said, he looked at me and said, I want fighting men, not cripples. What can I do with you? Well, Sheridan was not known as Mr. Sensitivity, to be sure. By our standards, he wouldn't function very well, but he was an awfully good commander. And this is one place where Keifer said, Sheridan did not favorably impress me then. He seemed restless, nervous, and petulant. And those two sentences sometimes get quoted. But the next thing he said was, I now think I somewhat misjudged him. And he went on to give a much more complimentary, much more even-handed judgment. Sheridan was someone he came to know better when both were in national politics after the war, or dealing with national issues. I'm going to skip through this for just sake of time. After he was wounded, he was shot through the right forearm, and it broke both bones, as Civil War wounds often did. The projectiles and the velocity combined to do real damage. And after it was splinted up and it healed. But he wrote this years later. He said, this was my first considerable battle after being severely wounded. And candor compels me to say that I do not think being wounded one or more times has a tendency to promote bravery or to steady nerves for future battles. He said most soldiers get over it, but, and there he is. There are significant controversies associated with Keifer. And I want to look briefly here at two battles, one fairly small, the other one very large, and we can't look at the entire battle, they're way too complex. I'm really looking for Keifer's and his men's involvement, but in particular, his role in the reconstruction of what happened in these battles. I think they tell important stories. This is the Second Battle of Winchester. You know too much about the Civil War if you know that there were 3 battles of Winchester, and you know who was in all 3 battles. Again, specialists will know that kind of thing, but the average, even average Civil War enthusiast might not know that. This is the Second Battle of Winchester, and it went very badly for the Union Army. There's a very fine book published on this by Eric Wittenberg and Scott Mingus. Eric Wittenberg is well known to this symposium. He's spoken here before. He's the attorney in Columbus who writes more books than most academic historians do. Milroy is the commander for Keifer and his men and the several other units involved here. The basic of Milroy, he was a rashly brave and patriotic man, and his whole heart was in the Union cause. In battle, he risked his own person unnecessarily and without exercising a proper supervision over his entire command. But he also says about him, the colored people of America should erect a monument to his memory. He was their friend when to be so drew upon him much adverse criticism. So although Keifer has criticisms of him, he also admired Milroy, and this was written, again, decades after the war. I don't like that map. Probably with his lighting, this is very hard for you to read. The western part of Virginia, this is in June of 1863, the Battle of Chancellorsville was the preceding month, massive Confederate victory. Lee and Davis are planning another invasion of the North. This will culminate in Pennsylvania at Gettysburg in first week in July. But the Union command doesn't know that. They don't know what's coming. And so their Union posts in West Virginia, in the area around Harper's Ferry, and one of the small towns where they're posted is Winchester. And they've been trying to hang on to these posts. They've been building up these posts here for the last several months. And when Lee reorganizes his army, he places the old Stonewall Brigade and other units under General Ewell, and General Ewell is going up through western Virginia, heading toward Pennsylvania. Now, this is Ewell coming up from the south, pretty much due south, heading up toward Winchester. And I'm not going to use all of these, I only want to show you a couple of them. Keifer's unit, the 110th, was one of the first units to engage the enemy south of Winchester. And they fought well and then had to back off. Keifer was worried that this was not just cavalry coming to harass them, but the real army, that this is a massive Confederate army coming at them. These posts in West Virginia could not possibly withstand an assault from a large Confederate army. They simply weren't manned for that. Milroy had about 8,000 men total. And so Keifer and the 110th fought here. You can see them here at the lower part of the map there near Kernstown, and then had to fall back. And they took up a position, as you see, facing another force because the Confederates are starting to move in on them from different sides. Winchester had embankments. It had three forts. It had several batteries. They're spread around. And so that meant for fighting in a lot of different places in different ways at different times. That was June 13th. By June 14th, there's a lot of skirmishing in the mid-afternoon, as you see here. And by the afternoon, you see the 110th over there, west of the city. You can tell that the battle has sort of converged now on the city, and the units are getting closer to each other. And the 110th is under heavy pressure, being attacked by Confederate troops. Gradually, these positions simply can't hold. This is too large an attacking force. And Keifer's men are defending an embankment out in front of one of the forts, about 1,500 yards out in front of the forts. They are fighting well. This is an account written, a report later, who said, here at the very bottom, what men we had did all they could. Men never fought better than these men did. They did not fall back until ordered to do so by Colonel Keifer. We were about 1,500 yards from the main fort. In other words, they fought quite well, and this was an artillery commander who lost artillery at the battle that was captured, but still giving credit. He said it wasn't their fault, nothing they could have done. They did all they could have done. By the third day, the Union is being routed, and units are surrendering, being captured, or trying to escape. And Keifer is instrumental in that escape. General Milroy catches up to Keifer and his men, and Keifer and his men at one point offer to attack the enemy in order to create a hole, even though they're almost out of ammunition, but to create enough release of pressure so that Milroy, his officers, and the rest of their army, their unit, can get away. And they succeed. Even General Milroy said, during this contest, General Keifer especially distinguished himself by the display of the qualities of a brave soldier and a judicious and skillful officer. The controversy comes in two ways. After this, Keifer was relieved of command, and there was a military investigation of his conduct, which might have led to a court-martial. It did not. Why were they doing this? Well, in Washington, they thought Lincoln and General Halleck, Chief of Staff, thought they had given orders that these small West Virginia posts couldn't be held, converge on Harper's Ferry, do something, but there's no way Milroy would be able to hold that position. But that order, as an order, never really got to Milroy. But in D.C., it appeared that he disobeyed orders and had lost half of he had an army of 8,000 men, he lost half of them wounded, killed, or captured. And the vast majority of those captured. So in D.C., they were very unhappy with Milroy, and Halleck in particular was angry. And they were planning on prosecuting him for violating orders. It's a very serious charge for a general, of course, for anybody, but especially for a general. Now that investigation did not convict him, and Lincoln himself said, it looks like there's no serious blame to attach to any one particular officer. On the other hand, Halleck tried to avoid giving Milroy a command position for almost the entirety of the war. He does get command of some troops near the very end of the conflict. And that animosity remains. Milroy was literally on his deathbed in around 1890, and he called for a judge to come in to take his last statement on his conduct at the Second Battle of Winchester. I mean, this became the event that weighed on his reputation and preyed on his mind for the rest of his life. But there was a second issue at the Second Battle of Winchester, and this really was not so much about orders as it was about judgment. Keifer didn't testify in the investigation after the battle. He said that was because he was perceived as a friend of Milroy, and therefore they didn't need him. But interestingly enough, Keifer was one of the people who according to his own account, told Milroy, we cannot hold this position. And he was telling him this as early as, say, July 8th or so. And he said, Keifer believed he had information that indicated that they were coming in, that the large unit was coming in. It wasn't just cavalry. He had his own cavalry out. Keifer had cavalry who would go out, they'd dress up, they'd wear Confederate stuff, and then they'd go out and try to find out what's happening, right? So Keifer was believed a large unit was coming at them, not some small unit that they could contain. And Milroy didn't believe him. First, he didn't believe that Lee would divide his army that way. Well, of course, Lee would divide his army that way. And secondly, he didn't have concrete evidence. And maybe he was overconfident. It's very hard to reconstruct now. But in any case, Keifer was always frustrated that Milroy hadn't listened to that advice and thought this whole defense was a bad idea. But at a certain point, the commanders made the decision, and so you do the best you can. Keifer's reputation probably was helped by this battle. The reports were positive about him, but as I said, Milroy's reputation was badly damaged. Now you might think the Wilderness is a year later, Shenandoah Valley, massive campaign, huge casualties. Lee versus Grant, this is a major encounter, of course. By this point, he's back in the saddle. He's recovered from wounds. He's commanding. I think by this point it's a brigade. And here, to tell you the story, I'm just diving right into the middle of the battle. At a certain point, the Union line. This is from Thomas Pope's book, by the way. The Union line looked a bit like this. And what you need to notice for purposes of our discussion is that the 1/10 appears to be on the far end of the line, which means it's their job to not get flanked. You don't want the enemy to get around to your right, get behind you. If they do, then you have the enemy on two sides of you, and then if you fall back fast, the guys to your left can't adjust rapidly. And if it goes really badly, the whole line starts to fold. Okay, so getting flanked that way is a very bad thing, of course. And Keifer's 1/10 are out there. They are not in a great position. It's not a great position in some ways, and they are ordered to attack. Keifer and his men are ordered to attack, and the hope is that they will be able to flank Ewell's army. Well, the problem here is that they're in a bad position. And when Keifer gets out there, he realizes this is not going to be a defensible position. We will not be able to succeed in the attack. And so he reported back up the chain of command that we won't be able to, this is not going to work. He receives another order that says, attack. And he thinks, they didn't get my message. So he sends the message again, and he gets a third order that says attack, right? And so they do. And it does not go well, and they eventually have to pull back, and they take very serious losses. Now, Gordon Ray is a leading expert on this, describes it the way you see here. The problem was that Keifer's use of his predicament didn't filter back to headquarters. The real tragedy was the fate of Keifer's men. Keifer said it was simply impossible to succeed. By the next morning on the 6th, now, I should tell you that at this point, Keifer was wounded. Late in the attack, about 8:30 in the evening, it was when his bad wound was received. If we had time, I'd tell you about his time in the hospital, but I think we'll skip that for the moment. So he's not in command by the next day, but his unit is still out there, and they're at the end of the line, except by the afternoon of the next day, another regiment has moved in to the end of the line. So Keifer's men are not on the far right end of the line. But in the battle, that line folds. The regiment to the 1/10, or the brigade's right, collapses. They're understaffed. They're undermanned. They collapse pretty badly. And Keifer's brigade, as it was known, starts to fold as well. And the line starts to fold back for a while. Eventually that stopped. Officers see it coming. They move men in position, are able to stop it. But it kept Grant from getting the victory that day he thought he was going to get. And Grant was not happy about it. It went around that it was Milroy's old command that folded. Now, Milroy hadn't been a commander for a year at this point, almost a year. But in Grant's head, he's still associating these units with Milroy from the year before and from what happened at 2nd Winchester. Keifer was furious at this version of events. He said, the presence of a general officer in authority or an intelligence staff officer representing him would have averted the useless slaughter of the evening of the 5th and the disaster of the evening of the 6th, which for a time threatened the safety of the entire army. Okay. Now, he did not put this in his report in 1864, of course. This is written years later. But it had festered with him. As he put it in his book, but somebody needed and sought a scapegoat. I want you to notice something there. Notice the quotation marks and the italicized word. Right? He's calling attention to the word twice. Somebody's looking for a scapegoat. And the somebody in this case is Grant. He's really unhappy with Grant over this. General Grant to Halleck, in an excusatory and exculpatory letter as to the disaster on his right, said, Milroy's old brigade was attacked and gave way in great confusion, almost without resistance, carrying good troops with them. And as Keifer said, this was untrue and grossly unjust. And modern historians are more sympathetic to Keifer's account. And by the way, Grant himself later retracted some of this. He realized he was misinformed or misunderstood. Keifer went on to say that if you look at the casualties our unit suffered in that battle, you would not claim that these are men who didn't do their duty and did not fight bravely, etc. Wittenberg and Mingus put it this way: Ohio's Colonel J. Warren Keifer, a 27-year-old attorney from Clark County who evolved into one of the war's outstanding line officers. As I said, Keifer lived to 1932. And what I'd like to do here is close very quickly with a line or so from his last order, his last general order to his troops in 1865. I cannot repress the deepest feelings of sadness upon parting with you. I mourn with you and share in your sorrow for the many brave comrades who have fallen in battle and have been stricken down with disease. Let us revere their memories and emulate their noble character and goodness. A proud and great nation will not neglect their afflicted families. The many disabled officers and soldiers will also be cared for by a grateful people and an affluent country. You have a proud name as soldiers, and I trust that at your homes you will so conduct yourselves that you will be honored and respected as good citizens. I shall part with you entertaining the sincerest feelings of affection and kindness for all, hoping that it may be my good fortune to meet and greet you in future as honored citizens and friends.